So we're now, as usual, going to consider some objections to Lewis's theory. We're going to do this in a few stages. So in this video, we're going to consider some less serious objections. And most of these are going to be ones that Lewis talks about in the text. So I'm going to pick a few of them that I think Lewis's answers to are probably pretty good, but that are kind of helpful for getting a better understanding of what a conventional theory of language really involves. In the next two videos, we'll move on to think about some more serious objections that I think really do pose some problems for Lewis. So one objection that Lewis considers to his account is that, well, it can't really be a convention to speak a particular language. There can't be a convention because we can't describe the rules of it. And so we might think, well, if you can't describe the rules of it, it can't really be a convention after all. And Lewis thinks that, well, this is actually just straightforwardly false. It's not in general the case that whenever something is a convention, you can describe the rules. And actually his rowing example is maybe one of the strongest here. So we said that, if you go rowing with somebody, you'll eventually sort of slip into a certain kind of rhythm of rowing with them. And it's natural actually to think that very temporarily a certain convention for how to row arises between you. But if you think about a case like that, it's actually really hard to describe what exactly you're doing. You have a kind of maybe a motor knowledge of exactly what's going on, but telling somebody explicitly what the convention there is would be very, very difficult. But nonetheless, I think it is plausible to think that temporarily a convention arises. So that's just a counterexample to the presupposition of this whole objection, the presupposition that for there to be a convention, you have to be able to describe it. So that's objection one out of the way. The second kind of objection that's worth thinking about is the objection that this all sort of over-intellectualizes the use of language. We kind of talked about an objection similar to this when we thought about Grice a few weeks ago. So the objection basically is, well, we don't go around with the intention to be truthful or the intention to be trusting. We don't go around explicitly reasoning that since everybody else is doing those things that we should do it as well. And so you might charge, well, the account is then too over-intellectual. It doesn't sort of account for the habitual nature of language use. But Lewis points out that the fact that something is a habit doesn't necessarily rule out it's being rational as well. So think about a bunch of the examples we used earlier on. And in fact, just think about driving on the road. Do people go explicitly through the motions of reasoning about whether it's in their interest to drive on the right side of the road? Do they think, oh, well, everybody else is doing it, so I should do that too? No, of course they do it through habit. But it's a rational habit. It's a habit they have precisely because those reasons are good reasons to have. So in a lot of these conventions, they are habits, but partly the part of the reason for them being habits is because they're rational in the first place. So there's not necessarily any contradiction between saying something that is a sort of rational activity in that way and also saying it's a habit. It's perfectly open to Lewis to say, while the use of language involves rationality in a certain way, it's a kind of habitual rationality, just like we see a kind of habitual rationality in all the other examples of conventions that we talked about. Another kind of objection you might worry about is like, well, can't we just imagine a community of liars, a community of people who just lie to each other in a language all the time? Because if that were possible, then Lewis's account would not be right. We would have a community of people who talk to each other in a particular language, who try to say false things in that language, and such a community would obviously not be truthful or trusting. But here I think Lewis's idea is that while that might seem possible on the surface, the more you think about it, the more it starts to break down. Because if everybody else decided to just lie to each other all the time, or they decided to try to say things that are false in English, well, people will eventually come to recognize that. So for instance, if every time I said, it's raining outside, I only said that in case it was not raining outside, eventually you would come to pick up that when I say it's raining outside, really what must be true is the opposite. But once that goes on for long enough and we all sort of cotton on what's going on, then it seems like we're just going to eventually end up speaking another language, just the opposite of the one that we started with. We might call the language not English. It's a language where every sentence means the opposite of what it does in English. You get the meaning of the sentence in not English by just adding not to the English sentence. Because if we all just decided to go around to start saying sentences that are false in English, we would end up eventually being truthful and trusting in not English. Because, like, for instance, whenever I said it's raining outside, you would come to conclude it's not raining outside. It's kind of hard to really coherently imagine a situation where we're successfully able to lie to each other all the time. Because if I start lying consistently enough, everybody else will be able to eventually anticipate that and draw out the correct conclusions from what I'm saying. The last objection we'll consider in this video, and it's maybe one of the more serious ones, is the idea, well, what do we say about non-literal uses of language? Because if you think about it, the idea that we're really truthful and trusting in English is a considerable oversimplification before we even start thinking about things like commands and questions. And not in a way that involves deception. So for instance, when I say things sarcastically, I say things that are false, but I say them in a certain way to communicate true beliefs. If I say, oh, he's a fine friend, I'm not being truthful in English, because I'm saying a sentence that's clearly not true in that kind of situation, and yet I know my audience is going to infer the right kind of thing. So it does look like non-literal uses of language pose a problem. Sarcasm is an obvious one. Think about metaphors as well. Metaphors tend not to be literally true. I could say something like, love is a rose, if I wanted to communicate something. I'm obviously not intending to communicate that love literally is a rose, but the sentence I've said is a false sentence of English. So it looks like I'm not actually being truthful in English. Lewis proposes like two different ways to approach what's going on here. One is that, well, maybe these are just exceptions. So one thing we said earlier on is that there are exceptions. There can be exceptions to conventions. For a regularity to be a convention, it doesn't have to be absolutely exceptionless. And maybe these just are some of the exceptions. Now that response is maybe not entirely satisfactory, because probably, if you think about it, non-literal or metaphorical speech actually is kind of quite a large proportion of the kind of things that we say on a regular basis. So Lewis proposes a different idea, which is that, well, maybe we need to actually refine the convention we're talking about. We need to actually refine the regularity that we're talking about. And so maybe we're not, as a matter of fact, actually truthful and trusting in English because there are all these exceptions about sarcasm, metaphors, and so on. But what a lot of these situations involve is that they're not situations necessarily where all I'm trying to do is straightforwardly communicate something to you, Lewis thinks. So we might restrict the ideas of truthfulness and trustings to situations where we are just trying to straightforwardly communicate with each other. And we might say, to speak a particular language like English is for there to be a convention of truthfulness and trust in that language in serious communicative situations, as he puts it. Now, the details might need to be refined a little bit further there. It's not totally clear why, sarcasm wouldn't count as serious communication. Similarly with metaphors, it seems like we can actually communicate important things to each other using metaphors. Metaphors are not just used when writing poetry or things like that. They can be used as devices for communication. So more would need to be said about what a serious communicative situation really involves. But I'm going to leave that objection there for the moment, because there are other ones that we're going to talk about in more detail. But that's one that you can maybe consider for yourselves and see where the dialectic should be spelled out from there.